The recording. Hi everyone. So today is March 29, 2023, and today I'm joined by Thomas Frayne. So not too long ago in one of my interviews that I did with Living Longer Stronger, I interviewed Coach Asanovich, former NFL strength coach who is still working with some athletes and working in a strength training facility of his own, where he is doing one-on-one strength training, primarily using high-intensity methods, focusing on efficient, safe methods of getting people as strong as we can. So we had a few topics on there, and we talked about how strength training has become more mainstream. And at one point in our interview, we talked about how at some point in the past, aerobics were touted as being, the be-all, end-all as far as health went, and that muscles were more vanity things and shown for whatnot. And I made a comment during the interview that it was ironic that a lot of runners look like they're sort of frail and gaunt and whatnot, and that they would have been held up as a picture of health, as opposed to bodybuilders who look like, basically the statues from Greek times and things like that. And Thomas Frayne, who I'm with today, pushed back a little bit on that and other things and asked some good questions, and pointed out that there are some marathoners and whatnot who actually have very good physiques. And he asked a number of other questions, some of which have to do with some courses that he's taking in university, and quite frankly, some of it were a little bit over my head because it has to do with specific athletics. But so Thomas, what I know about him, he's in Paris, France today, Thomas Frayne, and he is taking a course in, I think, sports science. Is that right, Thomas? In sports science. Right. So rather than try to send out a real long email, I thought we could have a chat, put it on Zoom and publish it. And so this is going to be more of a discussion. So Thomas, can you just tell the listeners and viewers a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And thanks so much for having me. I think it's a great idea to have a discussion, given the length of questions I sent over to you and was probably a little bit pushy on, so I appreciate it. So yeah, as you said, I'm doing a sports and exercise science degree in Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK, which is, they have a distance learning option, so I'm able to do that from France while I'm working my day job. So I guess I have an interest in the area and in general, and I guess I really like some of the topics you were discussing with Coach Asanovich, and you seem to have a similar philosophy on how you coach and train. And with the training I've done, even though you might have said the athletics might be over your head, the coaches I've worked with actually, just on a basic level have a similar kind of common sense approach to things. You don't want to injure your athletes, you want to stay healthy, you want to be consistent. So that kind of that was the hook for me on the interview, that okay, well, this is a great interview. It's great to have an expert like yourself and Coach Asanovich explain some things. But then I did have some questions. I was probably triggered a little bit, as you said, about the marathon runner comment, but I knew it was in good humor as well. So I just thought, well, okay, I'll just ask the questions I have. And maybe we can discuss over email. But as you say, maybe a call is the best way to do it. So I guess we can take it from there.
So first of all, thank you for the compliment. But the word expert, I always have a problem with that word, expert, because I think, I like to think of myself as a fellow struggler as opposed to an expert, because I sometimes joke, I reserve the right to be full of it. And what I mean by that is, the human body is a pretty complicated thing. And so, and recently, by the way, one guy that you want to check out his podcast that I just run into lately, his name is Jerome Armstrong. And does some really good things, and he always comes at it. He says, listen, I'm not the arbiter of truth here. If somebody presents me with evidence that, you know, contradicts or proves whatnot, I'm open to be corrected or whatever it is. And I like that attitude. And I think there's too many people out there who are basically saying, you know, I'm the expert. This is the gospel according to so and so, and anybody who disagrees with me is wrong. I mean, there's a few things that I feel fairly certain about, but I like to come at things from the point of view of this or that is what makes the most sense to me based on the information I've been exposed to and been available to and whatnot. So,
yeah.
And just to the comment on appearance and whatnot, I think it had more to do with how good people with good musculature look as opposed to how bad you know, other people look, type of thing. Because, and certainly if you're looking at people who are world class, people who do triathlons and things like that, you're going to see fine examples of great physiques. And naturally, I mean, being a natural ectomorph, even as a person who focuses on strength training, a lot of those guys are probably going to have bigger muscles and better builds than I have. But so where I come at is when you look at people who are elite in any sport, be it endurance sports or whatever it is, because they're elite, they are by definition outliers. In other words, they're the best of the best, right?
Yeah.
So and those people don't necessarily. It's hard to draw conclusions from what they do in terms of saying, you know, if I want to look like this guy, then I should do what he does. Whereas in many cases, for example, you've probably heard this before, people, you know, I'll use the example from Doug McGuff's Body by Science book, where he says, you know, people will say, well, I don't like bodybuilder muscles. I'd rather look like a swimmer. I like that build. So I'm going to go out and swim so I can get those kinds of muscles as opposed to, you know, bodybuilder muscles. But the truth is that people who gravitate towards swimming wind up in swimming because they have a body that is well suited for swimming. And people who gravitate towards competitive bodybuilding because they have the potential to have above average large muscles and be able to do that, just the same way as people who play basketball tend to be taller. And the fact
and you can apply the same to athletics as well, where you probably naturally find that if you're naturally a skinnier type build and person, that you're just more suited to running because you'll never add bulk no matter how hard you try. But
right,
that suits you for maybe athletics or endurance running, especially. I think just to expand on the comment about the elites are at either end of it. I think that's kind of got to the heart of the discussion you had with Mark Asanovich that day, and possibly with on another podcast you had, where yes, at the extreme ends of it, you have these elite guys that are, or women that are just at the top of their game and they're doing everything right. So when you bring it back to let's say the 90% of normal people who are doing sport, are they doing everything right? Whether it's weight training or whether it's high intensity weight training as you would practice, or I suppose you could go to the extreme of powerlifting and so on. Are run of the mill, let's say, club athletes performing all the exercises they need to do correctly? Are they doing all the recovery they need to do? Are they doing all the prehab and rehab they need to do? And the obvious one on the athletic side is that, someone joins a club to maybe lose a bit of weight, get their endurance going, maybe reduce the blood pressure a bit. And 3 months later, they have a knee or a hip or an ankle that's gone because they've just done running and they haven't done maybe any strength work to add to that. They haven't taken a broader view of what they need to do. So I guess that comes back to health and coaching. Can if somebody new to running who was doing it as exercise just sees running, yes, they're going to end up with injuries because an elite runner isn't going to get those injuries because they know what prehab to do. They know that, okay, I need to do maybe some lunges, I need to do some leg extensions and hamstring curls just to make sure my knees are protected. Whereas somebody new to it, maybe arriving at your clinic for weight training, or maybe coming to me, if, they're looking for some coaching. It's maybe not the first thing they think of doing. Is what are the basic things I need to get right before I can really get into this?
Well, I think that, I mean, first of all, athletics or sports per se is something that somebody does because they have a passion for it, and perhaps also because they are talented enough and gifted enough. And you said about the elite people doing everything right. Well, the first thing they did right was choose the right parents. And but that represents a very small percentage of the population. And now some people will participate in sports in what I believe to be the mistaken belief that playing sports is a good way to achieve physical fitness. Whereas where I come from is playing sports or participating in any kind of athletics is something you do for recreation. And work and as far as getting strong and fitness, that is something you do for your health and for your functional ability, and maintaining that functional ability well into your old age in order to improve the quality of life. Now, that is not to downplay the importance of recreation psychologically, mentally, socially, and all those things, but it's just to make a distinction between the two. And you mentioned, for example, that somebody who's knows what they're doing will avoid injuries by doing certain strength training exercises and things like that. So what I would say is they might reduce the possibility of that happening, but avoid might be too strong a word, because
Yes,
if
yes.
you choose to participate in athletics, particularly if you want to compete, it's almost part and parcel, with very few exceptions, depending on the choice of sport or depending on how often you do it, that there will be a certain degree of injury that occurs. And that's sort of when somebody chooses a certain activity for the purpose of recreation, if that's why they're doing it, unless they're doing it, of course, different story if you're doing it for a living. If you're good enough that somebody's actually going to pay you to do it professionally, that's another story. But either way, you're doing a risk-benefit analysis at some point. Now, of course, if you're doing it professionally and you're one of these people who could have, make hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, then, the risk-benefit analysis and the injuries that are there. And of course, that's subject to some debate, because many professional athletes retire at quite a young age and go on to live the remainder of their lives with a lot of aches and pains from their sports careers. But somebody who's just doing it recreationally for fun and enjoyment, and they like it. And I until recently, when I got too busy, like to go out and play hockey regularly. You're doing a risk-benefit analysis and saying, okay, well, why are you doing this? Well, because I like it, right? And then, so then there's a risk involved, and then you have to say, well, is the risk and or the possible injuries worth it? And of course, that's a decision that everybody is going to make individually. But if your choice of recreation is playing chess or playing guitar or just photography or things like that, then you still need to have conditioning. Everybody needs to have a strength training regimen, right? One of the questions you'd asked was, so I'm just going to read it back to you and then I'll ask you to elaborate. So it says, do you have a place for dynamic actions in weight training, especially in the context of psychomotric theories? I hope I pronounced that right. Example, a basic deadlift extending knees and hips produces similar movement to extension in running and sprinting. So I have an idea of what you mean and whatnot, but I want to just maybe clarify if I'm...
Yeah, like I guess I'm relatively new to this, and this probably comes into specificity that you were discussing the previous time as well. So, there seems to be an awful lot of these. The best way to describe it is you go on any social media, you see these mad exercises. So somebody has an 80-pound bar, 40-kilo bar here, balancing on an inflatable foot pad just to work their ankle. And, are you getting any benefit out of that for anything that you do in your day-to-day life? Whereas, maybe, I don't know, if you have a week back and you're doing a controlled, let's say, type of deadlift, or even just a more basic, maybe hip extension without going all the way into the deadlift, that's actually going to give you something practical that your brain realizes, oh yeah, I have muscles here that can hold me upright and take the pressure off my back. Oh, as you said, with the clients you work with, something like relatively simple deadlift that's not done to excess, or will just let the brain know it actually has muscles there that it can use.
Right.
And then obviously, as you get more, I suppose the question then is, as somebody might progress with their strength. So, obviously as we age, the rule of thumb is you lose 1% of your muscle mass per year, which comes back to your statement of it's a good idea to do some strength training. As people progress, then my question is, would you bring dynamic action into that, or do you think
Well, by dynamic, when I think of dynamic action, I think of as opposed to static, meaning that you're not just doing time static contractions like isometric, but things like deadlifts. So this is, first of all, full disclosure, this is personal bias, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not a fan of deadlifts per se, or squats. And I know some people will disagree with me, and the usual thing is that those are very productive exercise, and if done correctly, are also very safe. And I look at it, are you familiar with the work of Bill Desimone?
I'm not. No.
Bill, I actually happen to have a book right here. So here's a little plug for Bill. I don't agree with everything that Bill says, but Joint Friendly Fitness is one of his books. He also wrote Moment Arm Exercise, and his whole thing is about how to be safe when you're exercising. And one of his quotes is, when it comes to squats and deadlifts, people say, well, as a result of strengthening certain body parts, you're going to the supposed weak links that people often injure during squats and deadlifts will eventually be strengthened so that you can, squat and deadlift for life. And his argument is that you're just using up your free passes. And sooner or later, those movements will injure you. Now, I know, and a lot of people will disagree with me on this. The other one is the comeback where people say, if you do them properly, they're safe. Well, my challenge is, that may or may not be true, but let's assume it's true, that if you do them properly, they're safe. Well, that means, in my experience, you only have to do it wrong once to seriously injure yourself, right? And you could be distracted one day. And I put my back out once, and maybe this is where my personal bias was, where I could barely move for about a week. Doing deadlifts, and it was actually not even during a hard set, it was during a warm-up set where I wasn't even working hard, but I just was a little bit imbalanced and I didn't pay attention for a second, and away it went. And the other thing is, again, going back to Jerome Armstrong, who I listened to recently, so it's fresh in my mind, he makes the analogy of a rope that's framed. If you have a rope that you're using, and he talked about being a fireman and how certain ropes are used for different things, and that they have to be inspected regularly for fraying, and they have to be replaced every so often, no matter what. And the analogy of the fraying rope had to do with, you can use a rope that's pretty frayed, and it's probably going to be fine, but
eventually it might.
Eventually it'll break, and then when it breaks, just finish my thought. When it breaks, people will say, well, what happened that day that made it break? When in fact, it is subacute, it's been fraying for a long time. And then eventually something gives. And now you're saying, well, whatever happened that day might not even been while you were deadlifting, might have been while you were bending down to pick up a t-shirt.
Well, can I get you to expand on it
Yeah,
then? Because so, well, the first thing would be, let's just use the deadlift as the example.
right.
How would you, for example, then train glutes instead? Do you use machine controls so that you're, if you really want to get the hips pushed forward, training the glutes? And then kind of coming back to the question, I suppose when I said dynamic action, I was probably getting that more kind of fast or explosive, which, you know, I don't necessarily agree with either. I think there's this tendency to do all these mad plyometric jumps, and there might be a place for it in, for example, athletics or sprinters for 1 week a year, maybe in the week before a race, because you might get a benefit. But if you do it all year, you're definitely going to get injured. Um, so if you think of maybe having a deadlift bar that goes down to your knee, and then you're coming up and getting the hips to go forward relatively dynamically, or let's say quickly,
Right.
how do you replace that safely then, that's not going to cause the fraying, I suppose, maybe
Well,
my
I
question.
think that a good leg press machine works your glutes. A
Yeah,
Nautilus low back machine works your glute. A Dynavec gluteator works your glutes. But even simply doing adduction and abduction of your hips, which you can do with by squeezing a yoga block in between your knees using time static contraction, where you would, as an example, there are different modalities, but one example would be where you are squeezing in for 30 seconds using your estimate of 50% of your best effort, then following it immediately with 30 seconds of 75% of your best effort, and in the last 30 seconds, at some point, you're building up to the very best. And then you can
yeah,
do something similar with a yoga strap tied on the outside, and you do the opposite where you're doing abduction going out. And then if you combine that with even just a standing squat, that's if you don't have machines, you can do those things, and those are
yeah,
working your glutes. But going to the idea of your question, and forgive me for the long tangents and whatnot, so I'll summarize by saying, in the gym, build your major muscle groups in the most efficient, safest way possible,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then take those strong, recovered muscles and go out and specifically practice the sport. Like, for example, if it's running, if it's sprinting, it's playing football, whatever it is. And what makes the most sense to me, and again, Jerome Armstrong, he's done homework on that, where he's read the studies. He's not as lazy as I am. I'm a second hander where I take it from other people whose opinions I trust. And this guy has gone out and looked at the studies and read them line by line. He didn't just go to the conclusion at the end and whatnot, and sees how it's been done. But it's sort of confirmed for him that you strength train a certain way, and then you go practice your skill separately, right? And doing the two and keeping them both distinct, and
yeah.
that
And I guess,
what makes the most sense to me.
yeah, and I guess that, like, I mean, that tallies with, let's say, other other people with a similar kind of approach that I've heard, and personally I agree with it as well. Like, if you're working major muscle groups, um, when you go to the track, for example, in my case where I'm doing some athletics, you're hoping that the work you've done for the previous 6 months in the gym is going to help you turn that into speed, and you might do some specific speed sessions, because you can still think of athletics, even middle distance running, as I do, as a skill in a way. You have that major muscle group work done in the gym in a straightforward, simple way, let's say. But when you bring it onto the track, then you start to tune it to get it to work, to respond as you want it to on the track. But it's you've done the work to get it there for you to support that step up, let's say.
And
Um,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So no, I suppose that was the point. Yeah, that was it. I agree on the point
Well,
generally. Yeah,
one thing that I would add, and they may seem contradictory, but I think some of the popularity of functional training, or you referred to, about doing something while balancing on a BOSU thing or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I think where some of that might actually have, even though I wouldn't recommend it because I think it's unsafe, but I think part of the popularity and part of why some people believe that it works, particularly with things like balance, I think that I do think that if people believe in what they're doing, it affects their results. And
Yes. Yeah.
very specifically with balance, because if you think about balance, a lot of that has to do with confidence, right? Like if you're afraid of heights and you're afraid to fall and you try to go on a balance beam or whatever it is, you're much more likely to fall than if you're confident and you're relaxed. Well, if you've gone through a number of drills or whatnot, of some whatever functional training exercise are supposed to improve those things, I suspect, I don't know this, I suspect that, and especially if the person who is giving you this exercise, it's all more or less placebo effect, right? If the
Yeah.
person who's giving you the instructions, is regarded as an expert, maybe they've published books and they're very confident and they have all kinds of success stories and whatnot. And if you go in and you believe that, and then you go in and you try something, and now you feel more confident. So, okay, I'm ready for this because I've been training for this now for months doing this. I think that can have an actual material effect on your performance simply because you believe it will.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I mean, the point on balance leading to confidence applies in everything we do. When you think as you get older, you want to keep your balance when you're walking up or downstairs when you're in your 80s. It's going to be a factor in confidence. And I mean, I've been guilty of doing a few of these exercises myself. And personally, if I feel relatively safe doing them, I know the wall is right next to me and I can touch the wall and grab something.
Right.
They're a bit of fun to do sometimes, but in a way, they can have that confidence building effect. But they also have how would I describe it? They also seem to be a little bit like one of these fads that comes along and then disappears for a while. So a lot of the balance stuff 10 years ago, when I was doing athletics and it was a big thing, it's definitely faded and it's been replaced by foam rolling instead, or but there's definitely something to it in that. I know personally for running, there's probably no scientific evidence behind it, but the fact that you maybe stand on one leg with your eyes closed and see how long you can stand up with effectively your ankle twitching like mad to keep you upright because you've lost your visual perception. When you take a step on a rock outside on the trail and your ankle nearly goes over and you just catch it in time, mentally you do feel like, yeah, maybe that balance work I did helped me not fall over on that occasion.
Right.
So there's probably a feedback loop there, and it's probably one of those things in sports science you can never prove because there's just no way to test that.
Well, exactly.
If it's going to give an athlete some confidence, great. But if I was doing it, I wouldn't be putting the 80 kilo bar or 40 kilo bar or even any bar on my shoulders while I was doing it. It's just then you're into risk, and that's where it becomes, rather than being something that might help build confidence, it becomes something, as you say, where you're just taking a risk that you're going to fall over and have a heavy bar land somewhere on your body that you're not sure
Right.
which part of your body is going to land on.
Which, even if it could be scientifically proven that some of those things do improve balance or some other functional trait, right? Then you have to ask yourself, is the exercise itself, so I'm doing it in order to avoid an injury in everyday life. But if in doing so, I'm subjecting myself to an exercise that might injure me in the process of doing it, then it's like, you know what I mean? It's kind of like, I don't want to kill myself driving in a car at 100 miles an hour. So I'll practice driving 100 miles an hour so that I can, be ready.
You're taking the risk. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can apply it, like, for example, your discussion with Coach Asanovich on football, or if you take my sport, athletics, effectively you're running on pretty flat, stable ground. It's not like the NFL is being played on mud pitches like in the 50s anymore. So, do you really need to do that much balance work with a heavy bar on your shoulders, risking your career that's potentially paying you serious money? It
Right.
just seems like definitely at an elite level, the risk, the cost benefit isn't great for doing stuff like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it comes back to another point. Maybe I could tail off onto it, which was the element of where things become fads. It's like this is the current big thing. Um, so, like I say, foam rollers at one point came in as a big thing. You have to do your foam rolling, and probably there's a case if it makes you feel better, why not? But should you spend an hour every day doing it?
What is it that you're referring to? Sorry, I didn't quite catch
Oh,
it.
foam rolling. So it's
Oh,
you
phone.
have these foam rolling tubes that look, if it makes you feel better, it's probably fine. But are you going to waste an hour of your day doing it? Or do you might just do it for 2 minutes and feel better either way. So um, every now and again you seem to have these things come along, or somebody will come along with my way. As you said, my way is the gospel, and this is the only way to do it. And if you don't do my foot exercise, everything else you do will be wrong. So so I guess it can be hard to filter that kind of stuff out if you're trying to get involved in sports or trying to pick what to do.
And like you
There's so much
say,
out there that's just nonsense.
yeah, like you
That
say, if it's something that is, well, another fellow, I'm going to forget his name now. I can see his face, but he's a physiotherapist, and he also has a facility. Geez, I can see him now, and I'll put it in the notes when I do this. But one of the things he pointed out, and I mean, I go for massages, right? And my massage therapist of course, believes very strongly in the health benefits of massage. But and she may be right. At this, I'll plead ignorance, right? But I go for massage because I have some group benefits that pays for 80% of my massage. And
yeah
if somebody wants to rub my back for an hour for $20, I'm there because,
yeah
a back rub feels great. So my main reason for going is because it feels good, right?
yeah
But is there other benefits? I wouldn't doubt that there are, but gentleman whose name I'll put in the notes because I'm having a mental block, he pointed out that he said his field, physiotherapy, massage, all these things, he says they can't be proven scientifically because he says a true experiment has to have a double-blind study, right? So you're familiar with
yeah
that term, right?
yeah
So if you're part of an experiment and we're testing a drug on you, double-blind, of course, means for viewers who may not know, it means that you don't know whether you're getting the drug or the placebo, and double-blind means even the people giving the drug don't know who's getting the drug or the placebo, so that they're trying to eliminate the placebo effect, right? But if I can't not give you a massage and you not know that you're not getting a massage, right?
yeah
You're all or make an adjustment at the chiropractor's office or whatever a physiotherapist does and whatnot. You can't test it, and therefore you can't. And he said it's not to say it doesn't work. It just says that you can't prove it scientifically because I remember sometimes when I first started strength training and I was doing a lot of things that I no longer do, I started visiting chiropractors pretty often. And because I would strain my back fairly regularly doing things I shouldn't have been doing. Then every now and then I didn't have the money to go to the chiropractor, so I wouldn't go. And guess what? Things kind of healed themselves whether I went or
anyway
not, right? And that could be coincidence because that doesn't prove anything. I'm one person, one anecdotal evidence type of thing. So it's hard to say whether these things, because if you think about it, you got osteopaths tell you one thing, the chiropractor will tell you another thing, the physiotherapist will tell you another thing, the orthopedic surgeon will tell you yet another thing. And if
Yeah.
you listen to some of the guys in Australia who have been doing work on chronic pain, they're basically saying that often pain is not as mechanical as we thought, thinking, my elbow hurts, so there's something wrong with my elbow. It may or may not have to do with your elbow.
Yeah, I mean,
Have to
pain
do,
is subjective. So,
yeah,
I mean, the typical one with runners, that I've seen at my club where we put on track spikes or cross country spikes. You're putting a lot of stress through the Achilles, a lot of stress on the fascia of the foot. Calf muscles are under serious pressure. Effectively, you're effectively barefoot in track spikes. As far as the foot position, there's no heels taking some tension out. So, you get injured. You see injuries in that area quite commonly following cross countries or a sequence of cross countries or
right.
a sequence of track races. But exactly what you're saying, I just from personal experience, I think there is an element that's maybe you're not injured anymore, but your brain is still telling you, well, that got injured before. So it still feels sore, even though there's nothing wrong anymore, because it's your brain just protecting itself. It got injured 6 months ago. So yeah, if you start putting on track spikes again, it's immediately going to feel sore, but there might actually be nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, well, it's
And
interesting you say that.
that's where it becomes very hard to judge as a even if you have pain in general, back pain or pain in general in life, you have to wonder, is this just something that's psychological or something that's there that the body's protecting itself, or is it actually that there's something wrong? It can be very hard to distinguish.
Well, it's interesting because you're basically saying the exact theory that these guys in Australia are coming up with now. And they're saying that, pain is because the idea was, if it hurts here, then it's going from here up to your brain to register that you're in pain. And they're saying, well, it might be the other way.
Yeah,
So in other words, what happens is your body is basically sending a signal. A pain signal is to protect you, basically saying stop doing
yeah,
whatever or stop moving altogether. It hurts. But then they're saying what happens is that mechanism sometimes won't shut down, where the actual injury is actually all healed, essentially repeating what you just said. But
yeah,
your brain keeps sending that signal. You've probably heard stories of people who have been amputated
yeah,
and still feel pain in the phantom limb, right? They still feel their
yeah.
hand right there, and they still feel the pain as though it was there. So, yeah, I mean, like things like rollers and things like that. I mean, I don't know anything about them, but in your experience, do they feel good?
I mean, if you come in from a night on the track and, for example, last night we did a fast session and, the hamstrings feel a bit tight, you roll on it for 10 rolls and it might make it feel a bit looser or less, less tense after sprinting for an evening. So, but does that help the recovery? Will that make me run faster on Thursday? Probably not. It probably make no difference at all. Um, like if anything, you want the inflammatory response after a sprint session or speed session, like we did, for example, last night, because in 3 weeks' time we're going to be racing. So, uh, you don't want to be taking, for example, anti-inflammatories like you don't want to be taking ibuprofen or paracetamol to dull things, because actually is that going to inhibit the performance improvement you're trying to get? So I mean that kind of comes back to pain again, but masking pain and so on. So the roller might maybe just, I don't know, take some tension out or tell the brain that, yeah, you finished the session, you're sitting, it's an hour later now, you're rolling up and down this roller, so your head maybe just thinks, okay, I'm not on the track anymore, I can relax a bit. It might just be more of
Right, right.
a timing
Yeah,
trigger almost.
it's I mean, one of the things in the HIIT community, the high intensity training community, Stretching is not very popular, and people often say that flexibility is a vastly overrated thing and you can be over flexible. And some people feel that stretching is completely unnecessary, that you get all the flexibility you need from proper strength training. And I don't do a lot of stretching, but I do some stretching, but I don't do it for the purpose of improving flexibility. Now, I do think if somebody, as an aside before making that point, if somebody participates in activity that requires flexibility, such as a martial artist or a dancer, then obviously doing things that will improve flexibility are great. But for somebody who all they have to do is get the groceries out of the back of the car and things like that, I mean, you don't need flexibility, and being overly flexible can actually make a joint unstable and more prone to injury.
Yeah.
But what I have, again, anecdotal, one person, when I do have something that feels a little tight or whatever it is, and I feel like my muscles are tight, I find that stretching helps my muscles to relax. And I found that to be beneficial. So I'll do stretching, and I find either as a preventative, although I will confess that I'm not very diligent because I usually wait until something starts to feel sore instead of doing it as a preventative. But then doing gentle stretching, I do think, not for the purpose of improving flexibility, just to sort of let the muscles stretch out, and then they seem to go back into a more relaxed state after I've done that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Again, it's probably something you can't prove scientifically, but whether you do a high intensity gym session or a sprint session on the track where your nervous system is just on a high from 30 minutes or an hour or whatever it is of high level activity, it can just be a way to get everything to calm down, almost like a trigger to get things to calm down and relax a bit. I mean, I'm sure if you've done a gym session, sometimes I find that after a gym session or a hard track session, it can be hard to wind down after. So if you find a way that works to do that, by winding down, I mean to the point where all the muscles still want to keep engaging, it's as if they're ready to go. They're expecting more signals to run again or lift the weight again. So it's again, the science behind that, I don't know how strong or not it is. Probably, you do hear things like, for example, for footballers, soccer, I suppose you call it, on your side of the pond. There's been a lot of recent studies on, it's not a good idea to stretch before exercise, static stretching especially, because you might lose some power. But again, that might come back to, do you feel good or not doing it, and does it affect your performance? If you feel good doing it and it doesn't affect your performance, you might just do it to feel good. And these are, I suppose this is where I obviously fired a load of questions at you after saying your previous podcast. And I think we should be questioning these things. I think if you're doing sport, especially like, my aim in life, I'm working my day job. I'd like to move into coaching once I finish my running. And we shouldn't just be doing things blindly because that's the way they're done. It should be, we have the ability to question. We know if somebody asks us about stretching or foam rollers or whatever the fad is at the moment, you take it with a pinch of salt. If you feel good and it's safe, why not? I think I saw another interview with Coach Asanovich where he mentioned that he toured gyms in the summer, in the off season, so he could find the latest fads and just buy 20 of whatever it was, 20 inflatable foot pads to throw them in the corner, so his players would think he was up to speed with what needs to be done. So from his point of view was, you do the basics right. You get the basics right, and if there's some stuff that's going to be harmless, why not? And if it makes you look good as a coach, why not? But fundamentally, you come back to, am I doing the major muscle groups right? And my athletics coach is great for that. We've a really good focus during the winter season on not getting injured, doing main muscle group work, doing a little bit, as he would call it, the psychomotric stuff that I mentioned in the question. But really, like, if we're doing extension exercises that you're extending as if you would be on the track. So you're doing hip, knee, ankle at the same time, for example. So you find a way to do an exercise like that. But then the fad stuff, you want proof before you really, especially if it's going to be dangerous, before you start using.
So I'm just reading some of your other questions here as well. So one of the last ones, how do you assess or weigh in the Western bias in the data and research? I'm Irish, and like the US, maybe Canada, maybe 60% of people are overweight, fair enough. So of course strength training will benefit them, but are you ignoring the 90% of humans, the PhD students don't dang test or research?
Yeah, so this probably comes a little bit from a comment Daniel Lieberman, who's a Harvard anthropologist, made. I think I mentioned him in another question.
Yeah.
I find him a really interesting guy, and he makes the point that a lot of the Western research on health in general, which obviously applies to Western people, so if we're doing health research, we do it in our own countries, but ultimately, if you look at humanity as a whole, there is a lot of data maybe that we're missing, that, if there's 5 billion people outside the US and Europe, that maybe we should be looking at researching there too, to see how they stay healthy, and what works and what doesn't work. We might learn a bit from that.
One of the things I think is, this might sound like a silly thing to say, but are people fit because they work out, or do they work out because they're fit? And what I mean by that is, whenever you're doing any kind of research, you're gonna ask for volunteers. Well, who's going to volunteer? Well, it's not going to be your couch potatoes who are going to volunteer. The people who volunteer are probably, it's done in colleges and universities. So the people that are going to volunteer are the people from athletics. So they're doing most of this research on these people. So imagine if we could design an experiment, and we're going to do it for 5 years, and we're going to take 1,000 athletes, and we're going to say, okay, for the next 5 years, I want you to stop exercising, and I want you to become a couch potato. And I want to take 1,000 couch potatoes, and for 5 years, I want you to start exercising a certain way, and determine just how much of the results that we're seeing are based on genetics or things like that, and how much is based on what you're actually doing. And that experiment will probably never happen, because
that's where a guy like Daniel Lieberman is interesting, because he I guess you could call it qualitative research. He goes in the field in Africa and in Mexico with tribal groups to see how non-industrialized people behave.
Right.
So, for example, you might find it interesting. I mean, he had one comment or one observation was that as people went through the age groups, that actually the activity levels in older people increased. So you actually had grandparents would do more daily activities and tasks, foraging, or whatever the jobs were to be done, than, let's say, the 20 and 30 somethings who were looking after children. So if you put a foot counter or a pace counter, it was actually the grandparents were doing more activity, which obviously kept them going.
More, correct me if I'm wrong, more low intensity activity.
Yeah, low intensity, yeah, but at the same time they're probably carrying stuff, and there'll be enough resistance type work involved as well. I mean, if you're collecting food and so on, you're still going to be carrying bags, you're going to be carrying food or water. So I mean, from your point, you might find them interesting from that point of view. And it's actually the inverse relationship that you see now. Grandparents now are expected to sit at home and sit at the TV or sit in the kitchen listening to the radio. But if you look at some of Lieberman's work, it's actually interesting to see that, in fact, the inverse is the case, that grandparents actually probably even enjoy being a bit more active, and there isn't that kind of Western expectation that once the kids have gone to college, then that's it. You're just counting the days down. That's not the way it works in the non-industrial societies. So
well, one
you
of
know,
the things that most of the HIIT community has changed their mind about is if you read some of the books that were written years ago. I remember one particular one by Ellington Darden, where he was talking about what to do in between workouts in order to maximize recovery. And I remember he was saying, if you can sit instead of stand, sit, and if you can lie down instead of sit, lie down. And the idea was to do as little as possible in between workouts in order to completely emphasize rest and recovery. And now I realize that that's probably almost certainly a bad idea, that you should be always mobile. And like, I think, and I'll have to check out this Mr. Lieberman, we were made to move continuously.
well,
Do a lot of
it's actually
movement.
it's an interesting point, because you should, I'll give you some links to put to some webinars we did that maybe some of your viewers would be interested in as well. He made a point in this recent seminar I watched, that even the most obese person, or if you, barring the very extremes, but effectively humans that are even relatively extreme obesity are still more active than chimpanzees.
Oh, is that
So
right?
yeah, so chimps are basically sitting down all the time eating, and you're even, what you might call a couch potato, um, is probably more active than a chimp. But then you come into what's the diet like. My experience of being in the US, and I'm guessing Canada is slightly better, but in the US the food is terrible. I mean, there's a culture of eating out all the time, so you don't know what you're getting. There's no portion control. If you buy soft drinks, everyone likes a can of Coca-Cola every now and again, but even the type of sugar in soft drinks in the US compared to Europe is a completely different type of sugar, which seemingly triggers more, effectively conversion to
Negative
fat.
effects, yeah, high fructose
Yeah,
corn syrup.
so it's, I wouldn't just blame it all on I wouldn't blame it all on just the couch potatoes themselves. It's, you're so bombarded with the food and expectation, that how do you get around that? And especially if you go back to the fundamentals, humans were kind of designed to, okay, we'll go and get our food today, whatever hunting we have to do, but actually ultimately the bare minimum gets done. So I think you were making a point earlier about what's the minimum. Yeah, the point you made about if you can sit instead of stand or lie down. Humans are always looking to do the bare minimum. So if exercise effectively in and of itself is unnatural, we were never designed to go out and do exercise.
Well,
So
not formal, yeah. And one of the
yeah, no,
things,
exactly, yeah. So sorry, I'm getting into Daniel Lieberman's topics here, but I find it really interesting. Like, and again, this is one of these things where there's no absolutes. It's, you could become religious about some of the things he might discuss or teach or
yeah,
practice or whatever. But for example, the obvious one that he's known for was this barefoot running. So he was initially studying cranial positioning as an anthropologist, and that naturally came down the body towards the feet. And he found that in pre-industrial type tribes that people tended to be barefoot and they tended to run barefoot. But then he publishes a study on it, and next thing you know, everyone has to run barefoot running 100% of the time, which is obviously not the interpretation to put on it. The interpretation is to, okay, well, maybe there are some health or mobility or, I don't know, speed benefits to maybe going barefoot on a grass pitch once a week on top of your normal stuff. But the whole sports industry, let's say, takes the fad from a good scientist like that. His point wasn't to just everyone start walking around barefoot. His point was,
yeah.
this
Well,
might be beneficial because look how it's beneficial to certain groups of people.
Well,
Uh,
there's always commercial interests, and what happens, of course, is people, when it comes to research or anything, it's almost like two people you've heard about getting religious about something, but it's like almost if we were arguing religion, and we were, pick your holy book, whatever holy book a person aspires to, you can probably find a quote in there to back up any argument you want to make, and I can
yes,
probably find a quote in the same book that says the opposite, right? And I find with a lot of research, it's almost similar. You can find a research, a study that says one thing, and you can find a study that contradicts it altogether. But I think earlier you said a lot of times it's not rocket science. But sometimes a client will ask me, why are we doing something this way today? Or how come you changed the order of the exercises or whatever it is? And the truth might be it's because it just takes less time. Instead of walking across the gym to the other side, I'm just doing it this way today. Because I always tell people, here's where you start. The biggest difference is you're not doing any formal exercise at all, or you are. So that's your first thing that's going to make the biggest difference, right?
yeah, yeah,
And the second thing is, are you hurting yourself? Or is there injuries? Which of course, because if you injure yourself, well, that's bad. Obviously, that's sort of self-evident, but also comes back to the first one, because if you injure yourself, either because doing something improperly, not recovering enough, whatever it is, you're going to stop doing the exercise because you're injured, right? Like
yeah,
I
yeah,
heard it said that, with professional athletes, your biggest asset is your availability. In other words, if you're not available for the next race, you're not going to win it.
yeah, yeah,
So,
absolutely.
and then after that, if you're doing some sort of semi-intelligent program that's providing you and you're recovering from it and you don't hurt yourself, now that may sound, there's a lot of ifs in there. I can elaborate on what needs to be done in order to do that. Then after that, whether you do it a certain way or another way, or you change this exercise or this machine, or whether you do it, 2 times a week or once a week or 3 times every 2 weeks, those become, in my opinion, hair-splitting arguments.
Yeah,
Which,
yeah. Sorry,
just
go ahead. Yeah,
just to finish, I was going to say, in the realm of athletics, that hair splitting might be important, because if you're going to be in a race and the difference between being first, second, or third and not placing could be fractions of a second. So now you're looking for every little thing that's going to give you an edge. Is it going to help you to do the roller thing? Is it going to help you to, add an extra exercise? Then you're looking for every little thing. But for most of us who are simply looking to extend our functional ability, and also the fact that you don't have a deadline, right? Because if you have a competition on June the 7th, you're trying to be in the very best condition that you can in order to do as well as you can on June the 7th. Whereas I'm 64 years old. I'm just hoping to continue to be in reasonably good condition until I'm 74, 84,
yeah.
and 94. And as
94.
long as I'm progressing, if somebody said to me, well, you'd progress a little faster if you did this, I'm like, who cares?
I think it's a great point, but I think it applies whether it's somebody who's starting from scratch or somebody who's elite. Your first point. So your second point is don't get injured. So that comes naturally from the first point, which is if you're starting out, you want to do, what do I need to do that's going to keep me going consistently, that I'm going to come back to it. If I'm only starting out, I might go, for example, I might go to see you at your studio on a Sunday, and you might say, okay, well, maybe on a Wednesday, try and do 2 or 3 exercises at home just to see, can you get a habit going? And then when they come back the next Sunday, they probably didn't do it. But eventually you get the Sunday habit going, and then they might start adding in the Wednesday themselves. Uh, in some cases, it's just get the basics right. And I think that even applies at the elite level. I mean, you've got these athletes looking for, the cryogenic chambers, the foam rollers, there's so many different, they electrocute themselves to get supposedly faster recovery. But actually, maybe if you're not getting your 6, 7, 8 hours sleep, that's the first place to look.
Yeah.
Maybe are you doing the basics right? If you're doing athletics, are you doing your gym session in the off season? Are you doing your probably lighter gym session during the winter season, so that you don't get injured? As an injury prevention, and to help you maybe be a bit stronger when the spring comes. Are you getting all those little things stacked up correctly? And that's not that different to somebody who's maybe feels out of shape and just wants to change things. I know I've had colleagues in work who maybe at one time or another might be a bit overweight, and you just see them going to these so-called experts at gyms that they start making them throw kettlebells and change everything overnight. Change your diet, change your clothes, come into the gym 5 days a week, and guess what? A month later, they're not coming back anymore.
That's right.
You just do things slowly. Like, I'm only starting out in the field. I'm hoping to put myself in a situation like you are there with a studio like you have ultimately, and coaching athletics, probably still working the day job as well, but to be able to do something like that and enjoy it. But I've got a few people that I'm working with, and completely different walks of life and different, coming at things from different angles, but the fundamentals don't change. It's, are you able to make the habit? Are you able to, use your brain a little bit to realize actually doing the mad stuff maybe isn't a great idea, and maybe even be surprised that actually what the coach, or I wouldn't call myself a coach yet, but what I'm asking you to do isn't actually that difficult in some ways. I'm just asking you to get the habit going first before we maybe move up a step.
Right.
So to me, that's the most important thing, is that if somebody especially is coming from zero, that you want them to keep doing it and benefit from it for the rest of their life.
That's right.
But those same habits apply at the elite level. Then, are you good at keeping those habits going? Are you good at spotting, I've let that habit slip, maybe I need to work on that to bring it back? Maybe I let a few morning runs drop because I was just feeling bad, but yeah, time to switch the habit on again.
Your fitness program needs to be first and foremost sustainable. So that means the time commitment has to be something you can live with for your life, and it has to be something that won't injure you, right? So you can live it, and the time commitment has to be reasonable. And of course, where I would sort of defend the abbreviated mode of training that we use is, if you're participating in a sport, the more time you can spend practicing the skill of the sport, the better it is. So the less time you spend in the gym doing the conditioning frees up more of your time to do that, if that's what you're doing. And the tragic thing often is you see athletes who, after their competitive career ends, stop exercising altogether.
Yeah.
And then you see them and they get in terrible shape afterwards as a result of that, and maybe they just overdid it. But like you were saying, in 12-step programs, I don't know if you're familiar with 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah, I am, but I wasn't sure if that's what you meant. Yeah.
Yeah, so they have a saying that says, easy does it.
Yeah.
Easy does it means you don't try to change everything all at once. It's basically another way of saying baby steps. Start exercising, do a few basics, things like that, and just pace yourself. Because, another podcast that I would recommend is the guys from Discover Strength. If you do Google on Discover Strength, they do podcasts. One of the things I've heard them say is, it doesn't have to be rocket science. I mean, at the end of the day, I got all these fancy machines here, right? But if all you did every day, or not every day, 2 or 3 times a week, or even once a week, is one set of nice, slow push-ups to failure, one set of, say, chin-ups, if you're able to lift your own body weight, or do it some way where you're helping with your legs, of chin-ups to failure, and maybe even do some really slow, a body weight squat done
Yeah.
properly, done really slowly, lingering in the bottom part where it's hard, can be very, very demanding. And if that's all you did 3 sets once a week, would it be optimal? No. But the difference between doing that and doing nothing would be phenomenal, right?
Yeah.
Because,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
all they need to be. You wouldn't need me, you wouldn't need whatever. A lot of times our job as trainers, we're a little bit, it creates accountability because people show up for their workout because they're paying for it and because they know they have an appointment at 2 o'clock with Rick, so they're going to show up for it. Whereas if it's left to their own devices, sometimes they just won't do it. But at the
Yeah.
end of the day, they could do, what I just described. And the difference between not exercising and doing, even if you did those on Monday, you did your push-ups, on Wednesday, you did your chin-ups, and on Friday, you did your body weight squats. The difference between somebody doing nothing and in between there, go for walks, stay active, do some gardening, do whatever. The difference between that and then we could get
And
into
not doing it. Yeah.
the diet part and everything else, but for now, let's just stick with the exercise. And most people, even dieting, most people, even if you don't have a degree in nutrition, know the difference between junk and real food. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's a bit more to that, but most people know the things that they're drinking too many
Well,
beers.
yeah. I think, like you say, if you bring it back to basics like that, and somebody is doing a minimum level and they're motivated to do a minimum level, I think they would naturally, if they were starting it off, find that, well, actually, today I do my 10 push-ups. I'm not going to eat Snickers right before it because I won't feel great while I'm doing it. But I don't think, a coach necessarily needs to force the view that, oh, you need to change, you need to start eating porridge in the morning and you can only have boiled eggs for lunch and whatever. You can go into
Right.
all the diet stuff, as you said. But I think naturally, as you build good habit on exercise, the nutrition just follows because you just feel, you won't feel, you'll know yourself doing it. I don't know if you're doing a set of dumbbell presses or something and you're straining it to failure and you've eaten something that's a bit too sweet or a bit too
Right.
rich, you're going to suffer a bit more than you want to suffer. So you'll naturally the next time maybe, okay, I might just eat something a bit plainer, a bit less rich, a bit less sweet, and just by default, without even having to coach it or teach it, you would naturally tend towards that. I think there's a tendency with especially with the gym industry. I don't know what's like in the US and Canada, but I know in Ireland, like it's all, get them in January so they can lose the Christmas weight, get them in May in the month of May so that they can look right for the beach. And it's full on. It's you have to change everything about your life. But I think if actually you're able to work one on one with someone, you probably don't even have to mention diet because as they progress, they'll just naturally find that they want, uh, a more tolerable food that's not going to, you know, eating a
So,
load of cakes isn't going to work before a gym session.
yeah, some people do, some people don't. Like you say, here in North America, we are constantly bombarded with temptations when it comes to food. And there's all kinds of it. I have to apologize for stopping slightly abruptly as I look at my watch. I just have to get ready for a client. But I want to thank
No
you
problem.
very much for taking the time. I want to thank you for watching the video and taking the time to comment and reach out and do that. And I've enjoyed this. And of course, we can do it some more and explore it in the future if you wish as well. And
Yeah. Look, thanks so much for having me. And I suppose you got me thinking, and I'm glad I returned the favor as well. So I'm pleased about that. I'd be happy to discuss anything again in the future. It's a real pleasure to have been invited. So I really appreciate it. And as I said, I'm only starting out on this, whereas you know, I suppose I in a way I feel like I'm up in the clouds with with someone like yourself who really knows what they're doing. And I've seen some of your other podcasts, which, they're really great. And the people you've had interviewing
Well, thank you very
are,
much for the
top notch people, which shows they have a good respect for you as well, which, even more confirms that I'm very pleased to be here. So appreciate it.
Well, you have a wonderful day, sir. What time is it there in France right now?
It's nearly 8 o'clock in the evening, so dinner time.
Well then, have a nice evening and sweet dreams almost.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks again. Thanks so much.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye bye.